the pleasure to announce this lecture by Professor Felipe Gonçalves Silva, Privacy, Political Contestation in a Feminist Critique to Deliberative Democracy. Professor Felipe Gonçalves is professor at the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul in Porto Alegre. He's been a researcher of SEBRAP, which is one of Brazil's most important think tanks and a major center for critical research, critical theory in Brazil. And he's also been the coordinator of the research group Theories of Justice. Professor Felipe.
Boa noite a todas e todos. Good evening, everybody. I would like to first thank Professors Alessandro Pinzani and Itamar Oliveira in the name of all the organizing committee of this Humboldt Colleague on International Simpósio of Justice. I cannot say that along this week I was treated, you made me feel like home, because in my own house people don't used to treat me so well. Anyway, it was fantastic to take part of this wonderful meeting and share ideas with some of my favorite and most inspiring colleagues. Well, my talk today concerns the role of privacy in deliberative democracy, something that represents, in Habermas' own words, the kernel of classical human rights. However, I would like to address privacy, and I would like to deal with this topic partly from two specific issues. First of all, I intend to address privacy and privacy rights not strictly as a normative legal concept, but as components of a social field inscribed in political contestation and democratic process. Furthermore, I would like to do so departing from the voices that represent the main critical readings of the social field in contemporary political theory. That is, I propose to address this issue departing from certain feminist criticisms directed to Habermas. Having these guidelines in mind, I'll try to put together some diffuse references of Habermas' use of privacy and defend a particular understanding of it, especially highlighting some of its most prominent functions inside the democratic process. In conclusion, I come back to the questions raised at the beginning in order to verify how well this understanding of privacy is able to respond to it. So, I'll start by placing two questions that have led me to this topic. The first relates to the most technical problem of understanding the shift from the normative concepts in Habermas' reconstruction of the system of rights to the most diagnostic, descriptive apprehension of democracy developed in the second part of Between Facts and Norms. More specifically, the question concerns the different meanings that the so-called co-originality between private and public autonomy receives within Habermas' understanding of the political process in existing democracies. In Chapter 3, on the reconstruction of modern law normative self-understanding, co-originality is explained as a conceptual presupposition between private and public autonomy. At the beginning of Chapter 7, however, when Habermas begins the second reconstructive plan of the work, centered on the complex relations between civil society and political system, he makes explicit that this passage should not be read as a simple contrast between the ideal and reality. And in this way, it would be necessary to verify if the normative concepts of the first part of the book can be considered, even partially, rooted in the social reality of existing democracies. This kind of question makes some readers admit co-originality as something more than a reciprocal conceptual presupposition, and understand it as a necessary practical circularity. This reading seems to be the most correct, but it must be also admitted that it shows real difficulties in finding the specific meaning and role of privacy in the second part of the work. And this difficulty is not accidental. Habermas devotes an entire topic of this part of the book to delimit the concept and functions of the public sphere. But the same attention, however, is not given to the concept of private sphere, although he makes recurrent use of this term. The notion of the private sphere, thus, seems to be under-theorized by Habermas. However, this concept has been most emphatically problematized and discussed by his feminist readers. I use here Sheila Ben-Habib's work, Models of Public Sphere, as an iconic version of Habermas' feminist reading. Ben-Habib defends that any modern liberation movement is engaged not only in particular demands, but also in the broader contestation of the limits of the political itself. And in this process, traditional understandings of privacy has been challenged. In her own words, as with any modern liberation movement, the contemporary women's movement is making what were hitherto considered private matters of good life into public issues of justice, by thematizing the asymmetrical power relations on which the sexual division of labor between the genders has rested. In this process, the line between the private and the public are being renegotiated. End of quotation. Parting from this assumption, Ben-Habib points towards a deep ambivalence in Habermas' political work. On the one hand, she defends the point that Habermas' proceduralism leads to a conception of radical democracy according to which all themes and aspects of social life can in principle be problematized and transformed into topics of the political agenda. The chief virtue of Habermasian discourse model of public space would then be its radical indeterminacy and openness, as she puts it. When compared with the Republican virtue and liberal models, Habermas' conception would neither restrict access to the public sphere nor set the agenda for public debate. In this sense, discourse theory is presented as that which is most compatible with a general tendency in contemporary societies to transform the boundaries between public and private into the object of a constant political dispute. On the other hand, this proceduralist comprehension of the public sphere would not be compatible with substantive ways of characterizing privacy throughout his work, based on fixed social relations or specific topics of discourse. Habermas would thus implicitly incorporate some traditional constraints on the public agenda already contained in the liberal and republican models, identifying privacy either with ethical issues of a good life or with the domestic realm of family and household. Habermas would assume a conception of privacy linked to fixed social relationships by identifying the private sphere with family or domestic life. The family would thus be identified as the main and exemplary locus of privacy in which its members, free from competitive market pressures, could spontaneously develop their individual life projects. In doing so, Habermas would neglect the injustice committed in the shadowy interior of the household, such as exploitation of women's work, domestic violence, and sexual abuse, as well as ignoring the struggles of feminist movement to deconstruct both the holistic image of the family as well as the ambivalent character of some of its constitutional protections. I quote Habib again. Contemporary normative, moral, and political theory, Habermas' discourse ethics not excluded, has been gender blind. Power relations in the intimate sphere has been treated as though they did not even exist. The idealizing lens of concepts like intimacy does not allow one to see that women's work in the private sphere, like care for the young and the running of the household, has been unremunerated. Consequently, the rules governing the sexual division of labor in the family have been placed beyond the scope of justice. The tension between democratic politics and the liberal guarantees of constitutional rights, which I have previously defended, being resolved by the discourse theory, reappears at this fundamental point. I would like to propose, and ironically against Habermas, that the kind of discourse on the family and the sexual division of the labor initiated by the feminist movement should be considered an instance of democratization of the public sphere, and that a discursive model should accommodate this dispute in the distinction between public and private. End of quotation. With these criticisms, Ben Habib does not intend to advocate a suppression of privacy, but claims a more democratic conception, one that does not represent naturalized political constraints on the public agenda, and neither minimizes its specific value in the democratic order. As mentioned before, Habermas does not treat the private sphere clear and systematically in between facts and norms. And in many different passages, he actually seems to be still tied to what Ben Habib has called substantial ways of its understanding. More especially, he seems to be still tied to an appreciation that equates privacy with fixed social relations, such as the thick network of interaction found in families and circles of friends, as well as the looser contact with neighbors, work colleagues, and acquaintances, and so on. We don't have time here to highlight all the uncertainty and possible ambivalences of this concept. I would rather go directly to the passage that, even subtly, seems to better satisfy the procedural requirements made by Ben Habib. In the third part of chapter 8, Habermas writes, "The threshold separating private sphere from the public is not marked by a fixed set of issues or relationships, but by different conditions of communication. Certainly, these conditions lead to differences in the accessibility of the two spheres, safeguarding the intimacy of the one sphere and the publicity of the other. However, they not seal off the private from the public, but only channel the flow of topics from the one sphere into the other. For the public sphere draws its impulses from the private handling of social problems that resonate in life histories." What can be extracted from this section? In the first place, Habermas seeks to avoid here a delimitation of privacy made by the use of fixed set of discursive issues or social relationships. Precisely, the two components that would mark a substantive characterization of the private sphere according to Ben Habib. This suggests that Habermas is aware of her criticisms, although he does not state it explicitly here. Second, privacy is treated as a communicative sphere, and as a consequence, it is not presented as a desert island, a realm of pure individuality or isolation. It does not represent the confinement of the subject nor an instance of relationships strictly marked by self-concern and self-interest. Similar to the public sphere, the private sphere is presented as a dimension of social life that supposedly invokes interactions based on communicative understandings. Third, being treated as two communicative spheres, the threshold between the public and the private must be established in accordance to a corresponding communicative yardstick, or, as the textable states, according to different conditions of communication. It presents then what can be considered the central criterion to delimitate the private sphere, a differentiated access to communication. Unlike the public sphere, private communications are subject to a modified way of access, protected from unauthorized incursions, and thus binding participation to them with the permission given by their peers. I'm arguing, therefore, that privacy is defined as a communicative sphere constituted by protected access. However, nothing has been said until now about the nature of these protections. In this sense, Habermas writes a little further on. Private subjective rights protect the sphere within which people are liberated from the obligation to publicly justify their actions and omissions. This passage is one that explains that the protection invoked here has a legal formal character. private subjective rights shape the contours that delimit the boundaries between both spheres. With this in mind, these borders can be understood as historical constructions, artificially generated and constantly submitted to the sieve of democratic scrutiny. Moreover, if citizens are exempted from the requirement to give a public account of or justify their conduct when protected by private subjective rights, it means that they are allowed to remain silent, but are not obliged to. Habermas seeks to recognize that the communicative flows generated in the private sphere should not remain repressed within them, but can be brought to the public sphere according to the will of its members. The use of personal experiences of suffering and need, or even the identification of those involved by their personal names, may play an important role in processes of public opinion formation, being used in campaigns, dramatizations, and emblematic cases that draw attention to political issues and specific positions towards them. However, its use can only be considered legitimate if the subjects involved have refused to keep such matters within the scope of their privacy, introducing them voluntarily into the public agenda. In this sense, the communicative conditions protected by private subjective rights would be linked to the freedom for unconstrained self-exposure. In this sense, Habermas writes at the end of the passage quoted before, that the distinct communicative conditions must not seal off the private from the public, but only channel the flow of topics from the one sphere into the other. Thus, the communicative contributions generated in the private sphere must not remain isolated or damned within it. In democratic societies, the communicative flows must be able to move from one sphere to another, and these mutual exchanges between both contexts will be central in the characterization of the functions played by the private sphere in the processes of democratic view formation. So let's see now which ones would be the roles or functions of private sphere in democratic view formation. Democratic theory usually links the private sphere with a reactive role related to the safeguard of non-coercive individual positioning on the topics that constitute the public agenda. In this broader sense, the private sphere would guarantee the citizens' autonomous reactions to communicative flows already circulating in existing public spheres. Habermas endorses this first and most common function of privacy in political processes, but intends to avoid a strictly passive or negative understanding of it. In effect, if the public sphere entails a dispute for priority and relevance among a multiplicity of topics and opinions, those who take the circumstantial role of actor must gain the attention and adherence of a significant part of their audience. Habermas here uses the distinction between actor and audience stemming from political sociology to endorse the thesis that the political influence of actors rests on its resonance inside the audience of private subjects. In his words, the political influence that the actors obtain over public communication must ultimately rest on the resonance, or more precisely, on the assent of laymen who have the same rights. The audience of private subjects has to be convinced through understandable and interesting contributions on topics that they assume to be relevant. Thus, the reactions of the audience to the multiplicity of triggers circulating in the public sphere, expressed in the decisions of what they read and hear, or even in the political programs they endorse through their votes, constitute an empirical variant that must be taken into account by the actors and institutions of the arena, allowing the audience of private subject to exert an indirect control of the public agenda. In their everyday reactions The audience of private subjects would also take part in the decision of what comes in and out of the public debate. The functions that the private sphere fulfills in the democratic process, however, seems to go far beyond this reactive dimension. I quote a rather long passage, but one which I consider central to its clarification. According to Habermas, the political public sphere can fulfill its function of perceiving and thematizing and encompassing social problems only insofar as it develops out of the communication taking place among those who are potentially affected. It is carried by a public recruited from the entire citizenry, but in the diverse voices of this public, one hears the echo of private experiences that are caused throughout society by the externalities and internal disturbances of various functional systems. Systemic deficiencies are experienced in the context of individual life histories, and such burdens accumulate in the life world. The latter has appropriate antenna, for in its horizon are intermeshed the private life stories of the clients of functional systems that might be failing in their delivery of services. Besides religion, art, and literature, only the spheres of private life have an existential language at their disposal, in which such socially generated problems can be assessed in the terms of one's own life history. Problems voiced in the public sphere first become visible when they are mirrored in the personal life experiences. End of quotation. In this passage, political processes that emerge from civil society have their origins in suffering experiences related to different kinds of frustration or underachievement in individual life projects. The genesis of political processes stems from blockages to individual self-realization that resonate in private life. The main causes of these experiences of frustration are explained here by the outsourced costs of systemic functional imperatives, especially from economy and state bureaucracies. In all these components, Habermas emphasizes that the private sphere plays a germinal role in the genesis of under-institutional political processes. Much more than a merely reactive function, it is inside privacy that new social problems find the chance to be expressed for the first time. The endorsement of this idea can be found in other passages, such as the public sphere draws its impulses from the private handling of social problems that resonate in life history. The private sphere, therefore, is seen as a context of discovery in which new communicative impulses are generated according to the existential language of autobiographical warnings. These everyday life expressions of suffering, in turn, are treated as the first personalist thematizations of what can be later elaborated as new social problems to challenge pre-constituted and normalized political debates. This leads us to the following question. Why could one ascribe this genetic function to private sphere? What, after all, would give it the peculiar capacity to exert this germinal role in the political process? Habermas once again fails to give us an explicit answer here. However, we can find a possible response in the very way privacy was defined earlier. As a communicative sphere safeguarded from unauthorized interventions, it protects the subject from the unwanted consequences of a coerced self-exposition, such as stigmatization, mockery, pressure to conform, or political persecution. Consequences that can be especially hostile when live evaluations oppose conventional morality and hegemonic politics. In this sense, it would be due to the possibility of choosing when and with whom to communicate. The communicative conditions of private sphere represent favorable contexts to overcome discursive inhibitions, encouraging the first elaborations of personal discontent through the use of an autobiographical language. In conclusion, I would like to return now to the questions raised at the beginning. First of all, private, right? Well, first of all, the so-called co-originality between public and private autonomy can be seen not only as a conceptual presupposition, but also as the complementarity between the two communicative spheres in the genesis of sub-institutional political processes. In this way, the public and private balance each other, each supplying communicative resources for the other's benefit. As developed above, the public sphere depends on reactive and germinal functions fulfilled by private communications. On the other hand, the development of political processes depends on communicative elaborations of the public sphere. Private resonances of everyday life sufferings cannot yet be well understood as social problems as such. They tend to be interpreted as individual maladies or failures. Only when launched into the public sphere can these issues be treated as structural problems that permeate the whole society and deserve to be inscribed in the political agenda. Regarding the challenges put forward by this feminist critic, Habermas seems to elaborate a conception of the private sphere compatible enough with his democratic intentions. Privacy is then conceived in a non-essentialist way, meaning that it is defined as a realm of social life protected by rights that prevent unauthorized access to its internal communicative networks, rather than through discursive, context, or fixed social relationships. The boundaries that define the limits of privacy are not taken as pre-political givens, but are themselves considered artificially created in historical processes, therefore being open to questioning and constant political refinement. Most importantly, such boundaries do not prevent traditionally private matters from remaining isolated from public debate. In fact, private rights are not taken as obligations to remain silent. While protecting the individual against unauthorized interventions, such rights are linked to the possibility of a non-coerced self-exposure, ensuring the choice of the contexts in which one intends to make public use of one's communicative competences. Thus defined, the private sphere promotes the freedom to withdraw from specific communicative contexts, creating a protective shell for individual self-exposure. It seems, after all, that Habermas is able to give good answers to the problems raised above. But this is not the whole story. Although bringing together components of a discursive comprehension of the private sphere and highlighting its value for democratic political contestation, we should not assume too quickly that there is a full response to the new critical privacy agenda. And feminist theory still offers strong guidelines to refine it. In general, Habermas still seems to be unable to overcome what Ben Habib has called an idealized image of the private sphere, believing that the only threats to personal autonomy come from the burdens of systemic imperatives that the private sphere is, and that the private sphere is presented as a shelter against them, providing a place for the free expression of intimacies in horizontal and non-coerced encounters. Against this interactive, idyllic blueprint, the private sphere cannot only conceal non-bureaucratic and non-economic forms of power within the symbolic structures of the life world, such as sexism and racism, but also create favorable conditions for their constitution. Protected from public scrutiny, unjustified social structures and inequalities can produce systematically distorted communications, not only within the nuclear family, but in a wide-ranging web of institutions and social relations structured, at least partially, by private expectations, such as sexual relationships, educational institutions, medical procedures, church, and civil society associations. The assumptions of the incontestability of personal decisions and the protection of biographical data, as well as the reciprocity in intimate relationships, can be seen as part of the symbolic structures that allow the constitution and maintenance of power inside private life. What is needed here is the connection of privacy with a broader theory of power, one that embodies plural and non-systemic power structures embedded in everyday life interactions. Using in Allen's insights, what is initially necessary here is an understanding of privacy inside an empowered conception of the life world. The understanding of a communicative sphere protected from unauthorized intervention hardly reaches all politically relevant claims for privacy. In view of Beate Rüsseler's comprehensive study, Der Wert des Privaten, Habermas' concept appears to be especially inappropriate for the privacy of one's own body, a particularly significant issue for feminist thinking, due to its historical use to endorse abortion, contraceptive, and sexual rights. And even when considering strictly what she calls informational and decisional privacy, both closer to the understanding of the protected communicative sphere, nothing is said about the important issues concerning the risks to privacy posed by the new informational technologies. I'm thinking here mostly in internet and other digital media. Finally, when dealing with democratic value of privacy, it should be stressed that this is not a value equally available to everyone. Privacy requires an equal distribution of resources as its material conditions of possibility. And as Iris Maron Young has noticed, privacy theories have paid insufficient attention to material support for privacy. Young highlights the need for a personal space, a room of one's own, not as a luxury that social services cannot afford, but as a basic element of the value of privacy. In the same spirit, we could add that a complex number of other social goods are also required, such as housing conditions, health and aged care facilities, adequate means of communication, including safe technology, legal assistance, among other resources that prevent coerced self-expositions caused by the lack of basic social needs. Especially in high and equal countries, this is something that I would like to emphasize, plagued by far-reaching levels of misery, privacy is not mainly undermined by direct state surveillance, what tends to be most emphasized by the correspondent literature, but rather by the unequal distribution of its material conditions of possibility. Habermas touches on this point by defending a category of basic rights to provision of living conditions that are socially, technologically, and ecologically safeguarded, insofar as the current circumstances make this necessary if citizens are to have equal opportunities to utilize the civil rights. But this topic is abruptly interrupted in his argument. When he returns to it at the end of the book, it is mostly treated as a matter of defining the suitable means for participation in formal democratic processes. The focus is placed on political rights, and despite the importance of the issue, very little is said about the justification of an adequate distribution of resources necessary for the construction of privacy among all. What is required here is a better connection between privacy and social justice. What seems most interesting in Habermas' conception of privacy is its strong connection with democracy. The attacks on privacy risks destroying not only the realms for personal self-elaboration, but also the most basic conditions of citizenship, tearing down the democratic process at the point of its deepest foundations. Totalitarian regimes are constructed not only through the control of public sphere. According to Habermas, we could say that while privacy persists, there is still a place for social resistance in the re-emergence of political contestation. The complete control, the annihilation of any possibility of intramundane social criticism, requires the destruction of the political subsurface of privacy. Like many different countries, in the world, Brazil is living through a strong crisis of democracy. And this crisis goes far beyond the control of the public sphere, with instruments such as censorship and the manipulation of public opinion through the mass media. It is also characterized by strong attacks on democratic guarantees of privacy. In Brazil, it's not difficult to list evocative recent cases of these attacks. In the name of fighting corruption and endorsement of the rule of law, personal data as a way to collaborate in criminal cases has been used in a selective and abusive way by Brazilian authorities, without due fact-checking and any social accountability. Since his inauguration on August 2016, Michel Temer's government has announced constant extreme cuts to social programs, including a reduction of almost 95% of the budget previously devoted to the main federal social housing program, called Programa Minha Casa Minha Vida. Part of this budget intended to be redirected to government advertising campaigns. On March 13, 2016, the former President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva had telephone conversations recorded and publicly exposed on the internet, the first of a series of legally controversial measures conducted by Brazilian authorities that finally led to his arrest. The abolition of the right to privacy has not only jeopardized Lula's legal defense and kept him in jail until this day, it also calls into question the legitimacy of the entire democratic process that follows his incarceration, harming the political right of a citizen who cannot be voted for, but also the political rights of millions of Brazilian citizens willing to vote for him. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Felipe, for this beautiful talk. Okay, we have a few questions here. Joel, Casimiro, Ken.
Thank you very much for a very enlightening presentation. I like it very much. And my question is not directed against you reading about Habermas, because I can not do a good conversations in this kind of topic now. But my point is more regarding, because also you finished discussing the Brazil situation of Brazil. So we were talking during the coffee about this discussion about public sphere. So my point for you, to start a discussion, but you can answer after the other one, if you, is how much we have this public sphere in Brazil, is one point. And another is that I think that maybe we have to, just a question. If you, to understand what is happening in Brazil, you don't have to have one concept of, between concept like private but not public sphere still, because the people are going like bubbles where they form their opinions, and there are not really discussions. So this individuality, this privacy is built also in some kind of group, but there is no discussion there. So I think this is also a situation where everyone can talk, they speak, but our public sphere actually are very damaged, because we are not a public discussion about what happened. For example, is the cup has occurred and Dilma was fall, for example. The people just, okay, you will see what I'm intending to say.
Yes.
Thank you very much for this really wonderful presentation. I have another two small questions which don't regard your overall message, so to say, but just particular dimensions of the argument. as far as I understood you, there are two different ways to understand the relation or the interrelations between the public and private sphere, public and private communications. According to the one way of interpretation, there is a kind of genetic link between them. So to say that, that is to say that political issues originate from private communication. So this is one way to understand this interrelation, but according to another way of interpretation, there is not a genetic link, but a kind of coordination. So there's a kind of interdependence between public and public sphere, but they are on the same level, so to say. There's not, so you cannot say that political issues, political problems originate from the private sphere, but rather they have to be mirrored in private communication, in personal life histories. And these are two quite different ways to see this issue. And I'm not sure how important actually this difference is for your argument, but I'm just curious how we can respond to that question. The second one is more general one. Of course, there are much more radical feminist critiques on Habermas' inversion of the relation between public and political sphere, critics which denied the very difference between both spheres by insisting that all private is political and that all political is private. So how you can comment to this kind of more radical feminist?
Could you repeat again the point?
Well, according to some feminist critics, as far as I know, there shouldn't be a difference at all between the public and the private sphere.
Like McKenna.
So, like for example, by saying that all private issues are in the same time, by the same token, also political issues. But it seems to me that you insisted, I think that you are right by insisting that there must be a difference between the public and the private sphere.
Okay.
I'm afraid that I'm not able to do my question in English, so I will do it in Portuguese because I think that my thinking is more clear for me in Portuguese, and there are words that they don't come to my mind now, so I will do it in Portuguese, okay? I'm sorry. Eu vou primeiro fazer um comentário que vai chegar na questão. O comentário é mais ou menos o seguinte, que realmente essa questão do público e do privado é um dos fortes temas, uma das grandes linhas de discussão do feminismo desde os anos 70, né? É uma linha central importante, então realmente tem várias vertentes, acho que o feminismo radical é um deles, né? E dentre essas fileiras aparecem afirmações, por exemplo, que, sim, da simultaneidade da criação do público e do privado, né? E que, na verdade, esse privado serviu simplesmente como um complemento do público para que determinados grupos realmente não sofressem a interferência tanto do Estado como de outros grupos e para que um contingente muito grande de mulheres permanecesse prisioneira costumo chamar no privadinho do privado, no puxadinho do privado. Existe um privado que aparece na discussão pública, mas dentro dele parece que há uma área ainda mais privada, restrita, onde tem um universo muito grande de mulheres silenciadas e massacradas. Então, quando você... no doméstico, quando você começou a apresentar o pensamento do Habermas, eu pensei, poxa, como ele fugiu da crítica feminista pesada, né? Pontuando uma forma de comunicação, de possibilidade de comunicação, de ligação com esse privado, mas as mulheres não estão ali nessa conversa, é de novo uma idealização desse privado. E então, um pouco a pergunta vai indo nessa direção, né? É como eu não vejo muito bem como essa proposta da criação de condições materiais vai atingir, vai liberar esse sufocamento da voz ou essa possibilidade realmente de diálogo, de possibilidade, abertura de diálogo para pessoas, para essas mulheres que não têm direito à conversa nem dentro do âmbito familiar doméstico, né? A pergunta seria como a materialidade, como as condições materiais vão conseguir abrir essa prisão e possibilitar esse ingresso no universo do privado para esses diálogos. A maioria das mulheres é justamente fugindo do privado que conseguem no espaço do público acionar a voz, né? Então, a pergunta é como a materialidade vai ajudar a libertar, abrir essa porta desse quartinho dos fundos dentro do universo privado.
I'm sorry, but we will try to honor the principle of subscription. There is Ken, Michael, Marta, who else, please?
Could I try to answer the first three, maybe? And then we go.
Yeah, I was trying to moderate, and anyone can raise your hand, and I'll be glad to write your name here, but we did some.
I would propose to try to answer the first three, because they are still very complex and interesting. It's okay? Yeah? Okay. Thank you very much for the questions. Next round, please make easier one. I'll start with Joel. Very good question, Joel. Your first one is, we have public sphere in Brazil. My first answer is, of course we have. I started the paper saying that I would not like to treat this concept strictly as a normative legal concept. Also as a descriptive concept, a category that serves to describe, diagnose things in our political process. So we have a public sphere. The question is how it works. Habermas cannot make this work for us. It cannot give this question for us. But it's very important to, I'm defending it. The Nilsson was defending it some days before. It's very important to use some elements of Habermas' concept of public sphere to better understand the conditions of our public debate in Brazil. So we have, this first answer for you is conceptual. There is a public sphere because I'm trying to understand it as a descriptive, diagnostic concept. But how good, how it works, what is the quality of discourse within it, those are other questions. I cannot answer it now. You made some hypotheses. You placed some hypotheses about that, and I agree with you. I think they are very plausible. You, for example, talked about bubbles of semi-public discussions, or even if public, even when open to everybody, to any interested citizen, they don't function in a discursive way, like a rational, practical, rational discourse. They serve more to reaffirm solidarities, positions formed before the discourse, that kind of things. Yeah, I agree with you. I think that there are also progressive bubbles. We know that, not only the right-wing bubbles don't have strong characteristics of good exchange of arguments. The exception of problematizations made about our life world, the way we understand our society, the prevalence of values in conflict in our society, that kind of stuff. So, of course, we don't have a very strong, well-established public sphere in Brazil. I would also like to add in this answer that also Habermas in 1962, in structural transformation of public sphere, it was already his diagnosis of this structural transformation, a part of it, what he has called re-feudalization of society, or re-feudalization of public sphere. We have, we already had in that year, according to Habermas, small and protected place against public scrutiny, where people deal with their problems without accepting problematizations coming from outside, that kind of stuff. So this is a Brazilian problem, yes, but this is a problem of contemporary public sphere in general. I'll start with your, sorry, we talked a lot yesterday, it was a very nice talk, but I don't remember your name.
Krasi.
Krasi?
Casimir.
Oh yeah, Casimir, okay, such a beautiful name.
We drank a lot of beer yesterday, that was the
Sorry?
We used
We drink a lot, I know.
Beer yesterday, and that's why you're not able to remember my notes.
Okay. I think I'll start with the second question about radical feminism. Yes, of course, McKinnon has a much stronger criticism, not against Habermas, but against privacy itself. So for McKinnon, I think I could say that privacy has an ideological function. That tends to justify or legitimate different kinds of oppressions inside the so-called private places. But they're especially bad for women, especially aggressive for women. This argument is somehow placed inside Ben Habib argument, but Ben Habib does not take it too far as McKinnon. Ben Habib is saying, okay, I'm doing this criticism, but we should not avoid the democratic value of privacy. We should reinterpret it. We should reconstruct it in another way. And she, in that article, it was also a chapter of one of her books, she's also saying, okay, we need to reinterpret it according to a radical democratic theory of democracy. And I try to show how I find this answer, this reinterpretation in Habermas. It's not clear, but I think that we could find elements for that. Okay, and I agree with Ben Habib in Habermas, but I also agree with some part of McKinnon argument. So privacy has indeed an ideological function. Privacy really, this is the first point when I was saying that the Habermas answer is not enough, it's not good enough. Because but I used Annie Allen's, the notion, this is not an Annie Allen's notion, it's already in Habermas, but it's not used in the way Allen uses. Allen, for example, tries to emphasize something that Habermas states in the 70s, the concept of systematically distorted communications. What means it? What does it mean? Systematic distorted communications are some symbolic conditions that give the appearance of discursive, horizontal, non-coercive exchange of arguments or interaction, most precisely. But they are not. This appearance creates the possibilities to exactly the opposite, non-equal, non-free, and instrumental encounters. So I use Amy Allen here with this notion to say that we need a more ambiguous, ambivalent concept of privacy. Privacy not always preserve what it defends. Sometimes privacy is exactly the conditions for the social development of a context without self-exposure, without horizontality and that kind of stuff. Well, with that I want to answer you that I'm with Benjamin and Habermas. We have still keep the normative comprehension of privacy, and we have to keep its functions in democratic process. We have to have it in mind before give it away. But we need to refine the diagnosis and the theoretical conceptual instruments to make good descriptions about the social injustices, not only covered by those privacy assumptions, but that conditions of social injustice, inequality that finds in privacy the better context to develop. Maybe the problems of sexism are find in privacy their best place to flourish. That was my intuition. Okay, the first part of your question, I'm sorry, I'm not sure if I understand it, because you speak about two ways of interpreting privacy, and then you talk about the genetic function and another coordination function. Okay, I try to defend that we can find in Habermas two functions of privacy. One reactive and one genetic, creative or original. So why original, why genetic? Because we see there the origin of communicative flows that can be transformed in new social problems. We worked in the public sphere, that kind of stuff. They are not two different or opposite interpretations of privacy. They are both roles of privacy in political processes. Okay, I don't know if I answered your question or only tried to make myself clear. You can add another question, or we can talk about that later. Yes, women are incarcerated in private spheres, as you said. They find in privacy. This is one of the most classical feminist criticisms about privacy. Yeah? So privacy works as a prison for women in bourgeois civil society. The place for women is the private places, especially family and household. And the public sphere is a place for men, especially white men, that kind of stuff. How could I react to this intervention? Once I was exposing this argument to the feminist argument for someone that for a black woman, and she said, okay, but it does not correspond to my reality. I never was imprisoned in private sphere, and my mother also neither. So we were always in public sphere in a subordinated way, but we were also there. So this is the first reaction to your appointment But I would especially emphasize that what Habermas can incorporate from this feminist criticism. Okay, I think that he deals very well with something very strong in this feminism point. Habermas finally, it occurs, it happens only in Between Facts and Norms, as I read it, but Habermas finally understand and incorporate politicization of privacy, a radical politicization of privacy. We don't have any substantial content. Everything in privacy can be politicized. Everything, in principle, can be politically changed in the private structures. So I think that this point of Ben-Habib's argument was somehow well incorporated in his democratic theory, but he is still gender blind. He's not sensible to the most part of the gender injustices that we find in feminist literature. He cannot do this. This is too far. I don't know if a man can do this. I never saw a man describing those kind of gender injustices as women do. Never. But maybe we are in better situation, my generation, the next ones, in a better situation to understand it and try to incorporate in our main theoretical structures of thinking. But Habermas cannot do this. Probably I also cannot do this, but I would love to dialogue with those contributions to try to construct a better critical social theory. Okay, again, I use Amy Allen here to say, okay, we need to find legitimate forms of power structures inside privacy, inside the life world, not only privacy, also inside the life world in general. This work was not made by Habermas. I think that in the end gives us good directions to do this. How the materiality can help women? It was your last question, was it? Okay, my answer would be, for instance, having her own house. Having a house of her own, of their own. Yeah? This is very important to have a place of one's own. This is very important to have a place for yourself. Yeah? This is, so materiality could help. This argument that I use here, that privacy is endangered by an unequal distribution of the basic material conditions to fulfill basic needs, can be used here, as I think, in this way. So women have to be independent in this material sense.
I'm thinking about phrasing, saying that maybe the house upon alone is not sufficient because we can isolate and separate the houses. And
yes.
So we need to talk about power and status. And
I think that Karin would like to add a part of question, Karin. This is something. Okay, sorry.
Let's stick to the civilized democratic principle of raising your hand, and I'm going to keep track of questions. I have so far Ken, Michael, Martha, and Raquel. Anyone else?
Thank you. Thank you for a very nice paper. Very much the way you understood this co-originality of public and private autonomy not only as sort of values that you think about with respect to the individual, but as a way of conceptualizing a complementary relationship between the public and the private sphere. I think that's good and helps to break with this, we call it substantive interpretation or version of the feminist critique, which is right that the personal is political. That's the sort of slogan that I think you were referring to as well, that says no, there is no difference between public and private. The personal is political. And you may know Jerry Cohen used just that feminist slogan also to criticize Rawls for not having the best understanding between ethos and institution.
And so that you're putting this now at the institutional level, I think makes it quite interesting. I think there's a deeper, and I agree with everything, but I think there was still a tendency in your understanding of private sphere and then what personal autonomy is, which is what the right to privacy protects, right? One understanding of in Beate too, it's this decisional privacy, right? The right to have a room of one's own, space to make a decision for oneself, can still be misinterpreted as, I don't care what you think, I don't have to answer you. Yeah? I have been freed by my privacy right to give you any kind of account for the viewpoints that I have. You said I'm allowed to, but I'm not obligated to. Right? And legally, I think that's correct. But where it's not correct is in terms of how one thinks about what personal autonomy is. And here I think there's actually a feminist insight that strengthens and supports the kind of Habermasian view, and that is a relational or intersubjective conception of what personal autonomy is. And I've tried to develop this in some of my own work, but I would point to someone like Andrea Westland, who's writing on relational autonomy, where the idea is, the central idea is answerability. One has to give an account. So one isn't now exonerated.
Sorry, answerability. Could you answerability?
Answerability, correct. Yeah, accountability. That is, you can't just say, these are my preferences, and I have privacy rights, so I don't have to say a damn thing to anyone. At the core of an intersubjective notion of personal autonomy, not public autonomy, personal autonomy, is the idea that that you're answerable. You have to give some account to some relevant community. That doesn't mean, that any individual has to give an account to a state bureaucrat or to a critical theorist, right, about her cares or her preferences, but to a relevant audience. It's a hard question, but to a relevant audience of peers, of loved ones, one has to give some account in order for it to be a kind of reasoned view. And so this is an intersubjective notion of autonomy that is inside the private protections, the protected sphere that you were describing, that I think is actually a source for a critique of that private sphere as well. And that's very important, because otherwise I think it makes personal autonomy much in the feminist critique, just this private domain that I'm sovereign over and I don't have to give any account for, and allows for a critical potential coming out of the private sphere that might also help to deal with this complementarity of exchanges. That is, that the private sphere doesn't just react to the impositions of the public sphere, but in these life-worldly experiences, right, in these narratives itself, there's already some requirement for personal autonomy to give reasons for your cares, your concerns, your pursuits. And this, I think, can initiate, right? Love partners can't, just to swing up. Maybe we should, arrange things differently here. Maybe we, should arrange our bank account differently, or, why do you always get to drive the car and I'm always the passenger? This can, I think, initiate critical moments in the private sphere, and it's so that the feminist relational critique of personal autonomy, I think, is something that Habermas' view can easily take on. It helps clarify, well, yes, the personal is political in these ideological ways that you were describing, but you don't have to have this substantial critique of the family, right? In fact, the family can be reformed or restructured in the way Iris Young talks about, precisely through initiations of exercises of autonomy in the private sphere.
Yeah, thank you very much for your talk. People who would defend the private sphere could be a great friend of Putin. So some years ago, there was a big discussion in Russia if the violation of the wife by the husband should put under law or not. And Putin and even the Orthodox Church were completely against this idea, because they had the impression, if we do that, then we will become Western people, but we are East people. And then especially the role of the father in the family would be damaged. So with this law, you would damage the family. That was the main argument, that to put under violation under law, this destroys the authority of the father especially. And therefore they rejected completely this idea and said this is a Western corruption rather than decadence. This is the end of the family, the end of the state then. And therefore even Putin was a friend of private sphere, although in Germany once he worked as a KGB agent, so had even different ideas of private spheres as well. So the big question would for me even how to deal with the intercultural aspect of these questions, because we have societies where, sure, now in Germany, this was a great celebration for the feminist movement, when in Germany the parliament put under law the violation of the wife by the husband. But other countries absolutely reject this idea, and defending the family, and this is their intention. Could you give some advice to Putin?
Well, thank you, Felipe, for your presentation. I'm going to continue a little bit on Eusi's remarks. So basically, a couple of comments, eventually a question at the end, right? So you emphasized them as something positive, that the private sphere, a question of unauthorized access, right? So that it protects from mockery, stigmatization, and so on. So it's very nice because you see, oh, this is private sphere, it's something that we should value, that we should care for very dearly. But then we totally forget about the space of distortion, of inequality, especially gender inequality, but not only, right? Because it is within the private sphere that the dynamics and the logic of domination is experienced and prepared to be replicated in the public sphere. So of course this is, as you all said at some point, a much stronger feminist critique of the the distinction between private and public sphere, which leads us to also part of the feminist critique of conceiving the origins of this distinction, right? So you can see, it's not by coincidence that of course you see the Habermas book on the structural transformation of the public sphere, and yes, you have the public sphere which is bourgeois, very specific European of a part of Europe, replicating a logic that it's being consolidated, which is coincides with the bourgeois world, but also with capitalism. And we cannot forget that the invention and the proposal of this dichotomy is strategic. It has strategical value for capitalism, because suddenly it can, in terms of labor, it can provide free labor of women in the household, which is the necessary condition for public labor made by men in the industries, factories, and so on. So this is a problem to keep this distinction, and there is an analytical distinction between saying, arguing for private sphere and privacy. I think that they're two separate things, right? And they're two separate things. I'm going to give an example, which is, I think it shows well in the Brazilian society today how the private is becoming political, right? So you see, private, nobody really has the justification or the right to know what happens in one's house, right? So a classic in Portuguese, entre marido e mulher, ninguém mete a colher. And today you see the campaigns against the violence, against violence against women, that say, look, if you suspect, if you imagine that there's violence happening, being between man and woman or children, right? Violence, domestic violence, you should intervene. It is a political matter, right? So it is a social matter. We cannot keep saying, because we don't have access. So we need to reconfigure it, to reconfigure the boundaries and to rethink the justification for the keeping these concepts, right? A quick remark, of course, you said part of the feminist literature is attacked by feminists, saying, if you see from Mary Wollstonecraft to Simone Beauvoir, what do you hear? Oh, it's a bourgeois, white women describing the question of the household, that they are trapped, that they are incarcerated, but they are incarcerated in the sense that they are forced to be invisible. So it is strategies of invisibilization, of rejecting the possibility of having a voice. And you said, well, it's not really the case because I had a black woman saying, well, I never had that experience. Of course not, because there is the race question. And so and then you have black feminism. And what do you see in black feminists saying? Well, while in the white feminism, women are within the household, and they only enter the job market when they are necessary and because their labor force is much cheaper, right? But black women were necessarily immediately integrated, and they had strong, physically very demanding works like men. So the portrait, the representation of a black woman, of course it's going to be different. right? So you need to be sensitive to this difference. That does not mean that the feminist, from a white bourgeois perspective, it's not valid, because it is, right? So, because that is a critique that I make to part of the feminist literature, is because they start criticizing each other, and they don't see that they're doing a very bad thing for the movement, right? Because women should be together, despite the race or the class or the distinctive, even regional traits, right? So this is a comment. If I would like to hear what you have to say about this, yes, and also what do you have to say about this analytical distinction between private and privacy, right? As privacy, as no. Privacy.
Intimacy.
Intimacy.
No.
The intimacy, yes. Not in the sense of the private sphere, which that's my problem with the concept, but in the sense of having this space that allows for personal autonomy, or for autonomy that, of course, implies the redefinition of the intersubjective relations, because nobody is free if the other one is dominated or submissive, right? So, thank you.
I actually feel very well represented by Martha's question, but I just want to add two small observations. It's great when we fight to another, because I think I just disagree from you at this point, because it has been fantastic for us. We have been developing so fast because we are fighting to each other and our views. So, yes. And a second point, actually following Martha's question, is it useful at all that we defend such categories when we face, for instance, internet, social media's realities where public and private, wow, how can we describe what's happening nowadays? TV shows, programs, TV programs and so on, Big Brothers and so such realities. Thank you. So, is it really, when we face the social practices we have nowadays, is it really useful, or we would have to think a bit different, or try to forge a new analytic framework? I mean, just to listen.
Thank you very much. I must say that I don't have almost any answer. I have some excuses, some attempts of self-clarification, and I have many things in agreement of what all of you was saying. Well, I will start with Ken. Yes. Okay, I'll try to give some connected answers. Yeah, this is a case in which I don't have an answer. I have an excuse, because yes, I could not treat personal autonomy here. Yes, I know that this is very important for the concept of private sphere. This is mostly developed in what I call the first part of the book. This is very emphasized in the first part of the book. So, and this paper was directed to the most strict object of the relation between a private sphere with democratic processes of collective will formation. So, and I had a topic about personal autonomy here. I had to put it off because it would take me too much time. But you were completely right, and I also you described personal autonomy beautifully. Gene Cohen is very important and in the development of this concept, and yes, if I understand one of the points of your intervention, even the possibility to be completely alone in privacy, this is somehow artificial. It doesn't happen at all. Yes, I would agree with you. I was really trying to emphasize the communicative nature of private sphere. Yes, I completely agree with you. And when we are trying to exert our personal autonomy, we don't do it alone. We have to signify, to reconstruct our family, our work, our churches, yeah, every kind of social structure, relation that reproduce with privacy expectations. Yeah, I completely agree with you. Okay. Yes, so Habermas highlights that we have the possibility to be let alone, but yes, if we understand the intersubjective conception of subjectivity, yes, the main thesis of individuation that takes part in the socialization process, yeah, this is illusory. When we are trying to construct our personal autonomy, to construct our intimacy, so we always have to take part in transformations of intersubjective structures. So this was very well highlighted by you. I don't know, I have cows here. In Brazil, we also have a strong tendency to a defense of family in such a way that tries to isolate family from public scrutiny. For example, a defense that in school, in undergraduate school, we should not speak about sexuality. We should not speak about gender injustices. We should not speak about sexism and other subjects like racism, political ideologies, that kind of stuff. And the argument is accompanied by a defense of the family. So the family must be the place where individuals are mostly formed. Yeah? In school, we should not interfere in the education that young persons have in their families. That is completely against what we see here. Yeah? This is completely against of this way of understanding public and privacy. This is undemocratic. It's completely undemocratic, I would say. I'm so sorry if I gave the impression that I was trying to valorize or underestimate the speech of this black woman that reacted to my point when I was trying to express, to present a feminist criticism, and she said to me, okay, but I don't recognize myself in this blueprint. Yeah. Yes, you are completely right. What she was trying to say to me is that me and my mother, my sisters, They are all working outside the house, or in very bad conditions.
Another kind of logic of domination.
Yes, yes. Yeah, you're completely right in this point. Look, you put some points, Raquel, as I understand it, touches somehow the same questions. Raquel, when you say, okay, what's going on in internet, in social media, so privacy still persists. Yeah? Can we still understand the world we live with this dichotomy, this both concepts of private and private sphere and public sphere, especially the internet? It's very difficult to see it today. I tried here to raise the question with Habermas, is there still a reason to fight for private sphere? Normatively and in a descriptive way. So it corresponds to our word, it must correspond to our word. So my answer is yes, because especially in online world, we have unpredictable ways to disrupt privacy today. But we need to react. You know, we need to put some normative criterion against it. And I think that this Habermasian yardstick is very important, because we can say that this is not anti-privacy when I put something publicly in my page in the internet. It was self-exposition. It can be also things related to my intimate life. Yes, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter the content that I publicize. If I publicize my personal data, this is okay. So this is an important yardstick. This is important criteria to be enforced. So that's what I think. This is the first way to respond to it. But I myself have doubts if private and public is still part of our world. So McKinnon is fighting against the concept of privacy in a normative way. Privacy is it's not a good thing. Privacy should be abolished because it's ideological. It's just an instrument of domination. But I was reading recently an article of Wendy Brown, and Wendy Brown was trying to defend a genealogy of our incapacity to differentiate private and public. And new technologies was also her main point. So we are lacking the capacities to differentiate private and public. And I was also discussing this topic with the Newsom 2 days ago. I'm not sure if she's wrong. I'm not sure if she's wrong. I also like a lot a text of James Bowman. He asks us, okay, but is there still a life offline? And how can we replace this question in the offline world? Offline world would be a shelter for the resistance against the new technologies of control. I don't think so. We also have drones. We also have new technologies for recording our expressions. Sometimes automatically, you know, they generate data about our behavior, and that can be used in the future. panoptic control, find some kind of interest for it. So I don't know, I cannot answer this question. What I can say is that, yeah, there is still a reason to fight against it. And if we want to fight against it, if you want to keep some kind of expectation of privacy in the name of political contestation, in the name of new impulses of political reaction that comes from the underground of civil society, we need to have some normative criteria to combat it, to fight against. And I tried to put together some intuitions that I found in Habermas to enforce this kind of perspective. I have the sensation that I didn't answer anything.
Well, thank you, Felipe, once again for this wonderful talk and for all this great debate. See you guys tomorrow. Good night.